Hey, hello everybody. This is TJ with ShopBot Tools, and I want to welcome you to today's training where we are going to talk about open and duplicate vectors. So the first thing we want to look at is actually importing these vectors. And a lot of times it's really nice when it's easily being able to go click for import, grab our logo, and it does come right in place. But that's not always the case. A lot of times when we import something, it comes in to however it was saved in its previous CAD program or how it was exported. So for this case here, when I go to import in my DXF of my logo, ShopBot logo, I clicked import, but I don't see anything. So one thing I can do is zoom to full screen or hit F on the keyboard, and you see that I zoom way out. So from my 0, 0 point, I look way up here, and there is that ShopBot logo. It was brought in at a different coordinate that I'm used to seeing down here at my 0, 0. And sometimes it's just the way it is, way that it was saved in its previous CAD program or the way it was saved before it was imported here in. So if that's an issue that you're having, a couple things that you could do is highlight it, and you can center it by using the align objects or F9 to bring it into, by highlighting it and hitting F9, you can bring it into the center of the screen. But something I always recommend too is you can always bring up the file folder that it was saved in. Here's my ShopBot logo, and I can always drag this, and wherever I leave my cursor in the vCarve or Aspire software and let go, that's where it shows up. So you can always drag and drop, and that way you know when you're importing in your vector that it's going to be in your file. So let's look at next what the difference is between an open and a closed vector before we get into seeing what issues we may have with them. So a closed vector is a vector that has a start point and a finish point at the same position in the software. So you can see the green square here. That's our start point. The vector goes around and it closes right back there at that circle. Over here on this line where there's an arc, you have a start point and a finish point, which are at two different locations. So open vector, closed vector. And what we're going to look at today is where it's tricky when you zoom way in on what you think is a closed vector to actually make sure that it is closed and it's not an open vector with either a gap or an overlay of vectors. So a closed vector and an open vector. So after we import in vectors from other software, some of the things we need to be careful about are the open vectors. So we see a puzzle piece here, which if we just did a giant sweep select over, looks like it's just a regular vector. Upon further inspection, when I click on individual parts of it, you can see that these are open vectors. They have a start point and a finish point that are not together, which is not all the way around that vector. So in a case like this, we need to somehow figure out a way to join the vectors in the software. But before we do that, what we need to look for are vectors points that are either overlapped or not closed all the way. So to look at that, over here we have two different squares. And if I zoom in on the corners here, you can see one has a gap where the two vectors are not joined, and the bottom one here has two where they are overlapped each other. So when we go to use the join vector command, which is the fourth one down underneath edit objects, we can see that currently we have under the selected vectors one open, and upon clicking the join button there still is one open. By default you have a very small tolerance, 0.0004, very small tolerance on both of these, which doesn't allow them to join. And I would recommend that you do leave that at that small tolerance. If you do change this, say to 0.25, a quarter of an inch, it will allow you to close this vector. But when doing so, changing that tolerance to say a quarter of an inch and hitting join, watch what it does to my two corners there. It actually moves those corners. And if I undo that and I come down here, same thing, it would do this on this bottom one too, where I go to join those vectors with a larger tolerance, it's going to move them. Now the ones here I have in this example have been placed like this with a dramatic gap in between them, but I do want to point out something like this puzzle piece here where they do have a closer tolerance where they join. I would leave these at default, because if you start changing those to a larger gap, you're actually moving the vectors, which moves the angle of the joint, which moves the length of the vector, and that's not going to fix it. So if at all possible, it's easiest to change this back in the parent software where you're importing it in. So for this puzzle piece here, I'd like to highlight this and notice that I keep the small tolerance with 12 open vectors, and again I'm in the join vectors, which is the fourth one down, or J on the keyboard, and that allows me to hit join, and when I do such a thing here, it now makes this one closed vector all the way around. I switch to node editing. You can see that the start point and the finish point are at one position. So we also want to look at duplicate vectors, which is a vector directly on top of the other one. So right now we just see this line, which is a normal pink dashed line that we can see, and that's fine. What we need to be careful when we're either importing or when we're creating, that we make a circle, rectangle, whatever the object may be, and we hit apply, and we hit create. We get a little ambitious over here with our clicking, and what happens here is we create a duplicate vector. So notice that circle doesn't look as clear as this line down below, and that's because if I zoom in a little bit closer, I can actually see that I have created a duplicate vector. So sometimes you need to be careful when you're importing that things get duplicated, or when you're creating. And if I use my arrow keys here, I can actually move this vector over, and notice that I have a vector on top of vector, so I had actually created a duplicate vector. So a lot of times, one of the things that you should do when you're bringing things in from other softwares, you can always right click and do a selection mode, and you can select all open vectors, or you can select all duplicate vectors. So that's one way to look for things, is right here in the software, open vectors and duplicate. And again, that was just right clicking of the mouse, and that was selection mode. A tool that Vectric has actually added to this software that is very useful to this open and duplicate topic, let me zoom in here on my props, is right here underneath Edit Objects, and it's called the Vector Validator. And what's nice about this is I can hover over these vectors that I want to deal with, and when I click on the Vector Validator, I can go in here, make my selection, and when I search over the vectors that are selected, it does bring up some issues. And what's nice about this is it checks for spans, overlaps, and intersections. And in this case, what it's bringing up here using the equal sign and the plus sign is it's showing me where I have a lot of overlaps of multiple vectors. So I'm using my vector validator in this selection to actually see where my overlaps are. And what I could do, if this was a fixing of the zero length spans, it would do that in this option. But for what I can do right now is I can actually right click, and I can select all duplicate vectors, select those, I hit the delete key on the keyboard, and then what's nice about this is I can go back into my vector validator and it wouldn't actually show those, because now that I have this all cleaned up, it is one single line of vectors. The vector validator is really going to be your best friend when it comes to importing vectors from other programs or other files, because it's going to help you find overlaps and open vectors. In this case here, I select this heart, which looks, from this quick eye like it's a fine vector ready to cut. And the reason we're pointing a lot of this out is, if I was to go over in toolpath something like this, where I asked it to go in toolpath and profile around this, it is going to give me an error where there's one open vector identified. And that is great that the software is able to point this out. But I don't like to find this stuff when I'm ready to toolpath. I like to figure this stuff out ahead of time. So what I'm trying to show you here in this example is, even though I have this highlighted and everything looks fine, I could use the vector validator. But what I can also look at here when I click on this is I do see a line that is not as crisp and clean as that pink dashed line, again with the vector validator, if I select this, click on my little check mark and select it, I can see an area here where there's overlaps and intersects. So sometimes there are little lines right here. I select this one where I can see this was an overlap. So this is an example of where a vector is overlapped, and that would give you an error when you come to toolpath it. While we're on the subject of overlapping, let's take a look at this line. By the untrained eye, it just looks like a basic line across, and even if I do a sweep select, it looks like it's the line, one vector. But by clicking on individual parts of it, I see that this vector is not joined. And even doing a select over this and a join of vectors underneath the edit objects, join, it does have 4 selected vectors, and even by clicking join, I still have 2 vectors in there. And upon further inspection, I have a solid pink line here because I do have an overlap somewhere in my vectors. So again, this can be really difficult when you have a lot of things going on your screen and you're not specifically looking at them. In this case, I know exactly where these are because I placed them there. So that's where it's really nice when you bring files in to select them and to do this vector validator where you can bring these in and check. And you can see right here there is an overlap. You can see right here there is an overlap in this section. So in areas like this here where you can see that there is an overlap, let me use my arrow key so you can see that these have actually been overlapped. And next we're going to look at how we would fix this. So overlaps can be a number of different things, and let's look down here at this little banner. So I'll do a select, and I will show you that here that the vector validator, bringing this up, does show me that I have a little plus sign here, which again up here says there's an intersection, which we do have some funky little overlap going on, and actually we can see here that we have a pretty crude vector going here. So I'm going to hit close, and notice that upon selecting this, I can see I have a bunch of vectors that are overlapping each other. If I go into node editing, I could grab these different ones and pull them apart, but in doing so, I'm actually pulling apart the shape of the vector. So I'm going to go ahead and undo this back to the way it was. And if you come across something like this, I would recommend doing something like this. Come in node editing, come outside of where the overlap is, and right click with your mouse, do a cut vector, right click, do a cut vector, get rid of this nasty span in the middle instead of messing around with it, and do a right click and go close vector, and depending on the case, but this one here we would use a smooth curve, and there we go, we have a nice smooth curve. And I'll go ahead and sweep select this, use my vector validator, select, and that thing looks just great now. So here's an example of what to look for. Imported in this globe. If I do a sweep select with my vector validator, I got a lot of things going on here. And upon further inspection, even without looking at the validator, I can zoom in. I've got vectors that are overhanging, vectors that are outside of the globe. So there's a lot of different things. And when you import things in from other softwares or other people's files, it's not always going to be just a clean cut and go, ready to go. So that is the point of today's training, is to show you that there are such things as open vectors, duplicate vectors, vectors that aren't connected to each other that should be, and things to look out for. Another thing people run into is when they're using the text command, and when you create something with a scripture type font, you can see that there are overlaps in certain letters, and sometimes when you go to vcarve these with the vcarve toolpath, they don't always show up correctly. So one way to get around something like this is to select it, actually convert it to curves, and what you can do in a point like this to make it real simple on yourself is deselect all the centers, something that you don't want to necessarily connect because they're already individual points themselves, individual vectors. And what you can do from a point like this as you can actually go here to weld selected vectors, and instead of using your scissors to connect in all these different spots, by selecting this weld vectors, it will go ahead and clean these up and actually make these all together where they join, and now you have this as a selected vector that has everything joined, and you don't have to worry about snipping any duplicate or open parts of that vector. I want to thank everybody for joining us in today's training. We try to do these every 2 weeks here at ShopBot Tools for our free online training. Please check out our website, shopbottools.com, where we have all kinds of different projects, information. We have a great blog. We have a wonderful forum of different users, and we also can show you a bunch of projects that are ready to go, previous trainings that you can view. So just check out shopbottools.com, and we'll see you here next time. Thank you so much.